Okay, let's dive right in. We're looking at a super important moment in the Gospel of Mark. You've got Jesus and his closest friends on their final trip to Jerusalem. But here's the thing. While they're walking the same road, they're on two totally different journeys, heading for a massive collision of expectations. And really, that's the whole story in a nutshell. I mean, can you imagine? While Jesus is mentally preparing for his own death, the people who are supposed to know him best have completely missed the memo. They're busy fighting over who gets the best seat in a kingdom they don't understand at all. This is the great disconnect we're going to unpack. All right, so let's kick things off by looking at these two conflicting perspectives. They're all heading towards Jerusalem, the most important city in their world, but they might as well be on different planets. This slide just lays it all out, plain as day. On one side, you have Jesus, who is laser-focused on his coming suffering and death. And on the other side, his followers are caught up in this messianic fervor, basically expecting him to roll into Jerusalem and launch a political coup. They couldn't be more out of sync. I get this. This is the third time Jesus tells them what's coming, and this time it's the most specific and brutal prediction yet. He adds new details, like being handed over to the Gentiles, the Romans, and he explicitly mentions being mocked, spit on, and flogged. He's spelling it out in painful detail. So the key takeaway here is there is zero ambiguity, none. So how do the disciples respond to this incredibly grim and detailed prediction of his own death? Well, what comes next is, honestly, one of the most audacious, jaw-dropping requests in the entire gospel. I mean, literally seconds after Jesus details his own torture and execution, James and John pull him aside and ask for the VIP seats, the positions of highest honor right next to the throne. They are still thinking about power, about prestige. Their timing is, well, it's just completely tone deaf. And Jesus' response here is fascinating. He doesn't just say no. He completely reframes their idea of glory. He asks if they can drink his cup and share his baptism. Now, in this context, both of those are powerful metaphors for suffering and judgment. He's telling them, hey, you want glory in my kingdom? It's not about power. It's about sharing my pain. And this is just dripping with bitter irony. Because as it turns out, the only other people Mark mentions as being at Jesus' right and left are the two criminals crucified right alongside him. James and John are asking for seats of honor, not realizing for a second that the honor they're asking for is actually a cross. So this whole awkward exchange becomes a teaching moment. Jesus gathers all the disciples, who, by the way, are now furious at James and John for trying to get ahead, and he lays out the foundational principle of his kingdom. And it's a principle that turns the world's idea of greatness completely upside down. Just look at this contrast. It's night and day. Jesus points to the pagan rulers who lead by dominating people, by exercising power over them. Then he says, that's not how it's going to be with you. In his kingdom, greatness means becoming a servant. And if you want to be first, you have to become a slave to everyone else. It is a total reversal of how the world works. And to really anchor this wild idea, Jesus uses a very specific word, ransom. It's a term from the marketplace. It's the price you pay to buy a slave's freedom. Just keep that definition in your head, because it is absolutely key to his big punchline. And here it is. This might be one of the single most important verses in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus, this glorious Son of Man, says his mission isn't to be served, but to serve. He's blending two huge ideas from the Old Testament, the powerful, glorious Son of Man with the humble, suffering servant who gives his life to save others. Now, right after his own disciples have shown just how spiritually blind they are, Mark brilliantly introduces us to a man who is physically blind, but can see the truth more clearly than any of them. His name is Bartimaeus. This slide really puts it all in perspective, doesn't it? The insiders, James and John, they asked Jesus for honor and power, but the outsider, a blind beggar sitting by the road, asks for something totally different, mercy and the ability to see. His request comes from a place of desperation and humility, not ambition. And listen to what he calls Jesus, Son of David. This is a huge deal. That title is a direct, public claim that Jesus is the Messiah, the long-awaited king from David's family line. Peter had said it in private, but Bartimaeus is shouting it for the whole world to hear. So what happens? What are the results of these two very different requests? Well, the ambitious disciples get a harsh reality check. But Bartimaeus, because of his relentless faith, gets his sight back. And what does he do the second he can see? He starts following Jesus on the road. He becomes the perfect model of a true disciple, right at the moment when the others are failing the test. So now, with Bartimaeus following along, the group finally arrives at Jerusalem, and Jesus' entry into the city becomes this living, breathing demonstration of the upside-down kingdom he was just teaching them about. Make no mistake, this was not a spontaneous parade. Jesus' actions were totally deliberate, all pre-planned. He sends his disciples to get a very specific animal, a young donkey. By choosing a humble donkey, an animal associated with peace, he is consciously rejecting the war horse, which was the symbol of a conquering Roman general. What he's really doing is acting out Old Testament prophecy, specifically a famous passage from Zechariah, which describes Israel's king arriving not on a war horse, but humble and riding on a donkey. Even the crowd's shouts of Hosanna are quotes from Psalm 118, a song used to welcome pilgrims to Jerusalem. He's staging his arrival as a humble, peaceful king. So after all this commotion, the crowds, the prophecies, the big entrance, the climax is weirdly quiet. He goes to the temple, the very heart of the nation's spiritual life, but he doesn't give some grand speech or do a big miracle. He just looks around. And then, because it was late, he leaves. That's it. But that phrase, looked around, is so loaded with meaning. The Greek word used here, parabolepo, doesn't just mean a casual glance. It implies a deep, piercing inspection. It's a look of evaluation, of judgment. He isn't just seeing the temple, he is assessing it, sizing it up. And that leaves us right here with this final ominous question. As this servant king stood there, in the very center of his nation's worship, what did his evaluative gaze fall on? What judgment did he make in that moment? And what was he planning to do about it? Because the stage is now set for the most dramatic week in history.